a graduate of Tulane University. Everything that I studied had absolutely nothing to do with the work that I do here. I was a major in psychology. And I have a special guest here today with me in the back here, the white-haired guy back there, that's Mr. Pat Snuffer, the owner of Snuffer's Restaurants. Believe it or not, he and I were football teammates together at Tulane in the mid-'60s. And for as wussy as he looks now, he was pretty tough. Pretty damn tough, I'll tell you. But anyway, it's a very great pleasure to be here. I'm glad that so many of you folks could make the effort to get here on a beautiful Saturday and give it up to hear this. And I think that you'll enjoy it. The lecture is based on the book, and what it deals with basically is the ancient history of life on both the planet and particularly human origins, because that's what the book is about. It's called Everything You Know Is Wrong, Book 1, Human Origins. For those of you who will want to get it when this is over with, and I don't blame you for waiting to see if I'm worth anything, but if you decide to get the book, it's $20, and I'll be selling them in the back. I'll do the presentation, and we'll have a brief break, because the presentation goes about 2 hours, and then we'll have a question and answer session that frequently runs 45 minutes to an hour. So as long as you guys want to sit here and grill me, I'll do the best I can to answer. So with that said, we'll get cranking. Can somebody kill the lights? Okay, first line. All right, what we're all told and what we're all taught is that life began like this. This is the prebiotic seeds right here with inorganic chemicals floating around in the water. You all know the story. Somehow these inorganic molecules, water, ammonia, formaldehyde, etc., find their way onto a magical chemical yellow brick road. This is the reality line right here. This is what things do in reality. But somehow in the distant past, they found their way onto something that allowed them to link electrons in a way they don't normally do and make more complicated molecules like fatty acids, purine, sugars, amino acids. These went further down that chemical yellow brick road and linked up into really complex molecules like proteins, DNA, and lipids. Again, doesn't really happen in the real world. But once it had reached this imaginary stage, it was then hit with a bunch of these were hit with a lightning bolt. That's what we're all taught, a lightning bolt, that somehow swept them into a living thing. As we see right here, this is the first living thing. Well, what are the odds of that? What would it take? Well, this first living thing would have to be the size of, say, a virus at a minimum. A virus being the smallest thing that we know of that has partial life. A virus is not technically alive in the sense that to be truly alive, you have to take nourishment out of the environment and you have to be able to replicate yourself, reproduce yourself ad infinitum. So that's what the first living thing could do. So we're talking 5 to 10 strands of DNA minimum just to do the housekeeping of turning the inorganic molecules here into food, into energy, and to be able to replicate itself. Now notice, if you will, that this is a lipid right here. Each of these little blue balls is a lipid. Lipids hook up head to tail to make a membrane. So this membrane would have thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million lipids just to make the membrane. So you see what we're talking about in terms of complexity. The odds of this happening the way we are taught are astronomical. They are, next slide please, on the order of this analogy. A tornado sweeping through a junkyard to correctly assemble a Boeing 747. And people always laugh at this, but this is a very accurate analogy created by Fred Hoyle, an astronomer from England. So as we can see, it did not happen. It's a joke to even pretend that it did. And yet, this is in every scientific textbook that there is, and this is what your children and grandchildren are being taught to this day. And yet we have known for a long time that it's not true from the beginning. But science has to offer something to explain it. Because the creationists say, well, it all happened magically, that God did it. And was just able to, extend his finger and make everything happen. That's pretty hard to defeat in natural terms, which is what the Darwinists are up against. They have to explain everything in natural terms, using only the components that exist on the earth as we know it. So this is the best they can come up with, and they go with it. And, ironically enough, we accept it. We accept it. We just go, no, we don't expect them to lie. We don't expect them to have an agenda. That's what happens. Understand that. So if this is wrong, if this is not true, what do we know? What can we count on? What is real? Okay, next slide, please. All right, here's what happened that we know for sure. At 5 to 10 billion years ago, the solar cloud of dust and gas compressed itself and began to form the solar system. And as it squeezed out, it's kind of like a pancake across a griddle. That's called the ecliptic. Flattened out, and all the planets and sun formed themselves in this flat disk. Here it's called the point of coalescing. This is at 4.5 billion years ago. So here we're 5 to 10. Here we're 4.5. The sun has ignited, and the planets have taken their shapes, but they're still seething balls of magma, of lava. Now down here, after 2 more billion years to 2.5 billion years, we have the continental threshold for Earth. Each planet would have coalesced at different rates because they're different sizes and all that. Earth reached the the continental threshold. The continental threshold at 2.5 billion years ago, and that is land as we know land, water, seas as we know seas. Not the shape that they have today or anywhere near it, but there was dry land, and the water had cooled down enough to where it was temperatures somewhat like we have today. The continental threshold, 2.5 billion years ago. Well, it was assumed that life, that lightning bolt, would have struck around here because that's the first time when the Earth was hospitable to life. Life could really make it here. But we found out a couple of decades ago, 20 years ago or so, that no, it didn't come here. It came all the way back here at 4 billion years ago, not 2.5, at 4 billion years ago. We have the first life forms appearing in the fossil record that we have. And so what that means is Earth was still a seething ball of magma for all intents and purposes when the first life appeared. And that doesn't make sense because in situations like that, what do you do when you go in a chemistry lab and you want to break molecular bonds? What do? You heat them. They're not going to be coming together. They're going to be flying apart. Let's take a look at the next slide. This is the atmosphere we're talking about. This is what Earth would have looked like everywhere. Seething magma, hardening crust, some pieces of hardening crust, but still magma seething up in steam, which was busy creating the atmosphere. Not much of an incubator for incipient life to begin in the way the Darwinians say, from simplicity leading to ever more complexity. Didn't happen that way. And furthermore, we believed for a very long time that there was only one original life form, which is called prokaryotic bacteria. But guess what? They found out in the late 1980s, about 10 years ago, that there was not just one, there were two. Two original, separate, distinct, different types of prokaryotic bacteria. The archaea and the true bacteria appear at around 4 billion years ago. None of this makes sense in terms of the Darwinian paradigm, and this is why it is not talked about, and this is why it is not taught. But this is the way it happened. Next slide, please. All right, this is what that first life form looked like. This is a chain of prokaryotic bacteria 3.8 billion years ago from a stromatolite in Australia. Notice it links up into these chains like this. Each one is a single prokaryotic bacteria. This is a modern string of cyanobacteria, blue-green algae, and what it tells us is there has been virtually no evolution for 4 billion years for the first life form. Same thing. That's how we know what they were, because they haven't changed. Now that doesn't make sense either, does it? You would think if anything's going to have evolved, it would be the first life form, but it hasn't. Pretty weird. Okay, next slide, please. This is what they look like in cutaway. This is a prokaryotic bacteria in cutaway. Single cell bacteria, remember. All right, we have the membrane, cell membrane around. We have the cytoplasm, which is the kind of clear-colored goop that fills the cell. The ribosomes are the little energy generators inside. You see them all over the place. The nucleoid is where the DNA rather is held, and there are hundreds of strands of DNA. Remember we talked about that first living thing would have to be maybe 5 or 10 strands of DNA. This is in the hundreds already here. Now notice it does not have a nucleus. That is what distinguishes a prokaryote from everything else that follows, which does have a nucleus, and we'll see that in a moment. But no nucleus for the prokaryotes, but hundreds of strands of DNA. Now that first thing that we were talking about, remember the virus, the first living thing that would have to be hit by the lightning bolt? That's the size of one of these ribosomes in here, any one of these. So as we can see, the first true living life form contained thousands of what should have been the first living thing on Earth. So we see that the first true actual living thing to come to Earth, these prokaryotes, were extremely developed relative to what that first thing would have to be. So that tells us a couple of things. That the first thing, whatever it was, came from billions of years prior to 4 billion years, and it came from somewhere else. It didn't come from Earth. Life came to Earth from somewhere else. It's obvious to anyone. So keep that in mind. These things dominate from when they come around 4 billion years ago to around 2 billion years ago. They're producing oxygen that is tying up the iron that is all over the seas and the earth, turning the iron into iron oxide, and there comes a point when you're saturated with iron oxide and you can then start putting oxygen into the atmosphere. Okay? Around 2 billion years ago, next slide please, the second life form comes, and it's the eukaryotes. We've had the prokaryotes, and now we have the eukaryotes. Now, if you will notice that around 2 billion years ago, we have something that's 10 to 100 times larger than prokaryotes and 100 to 1,000 times more complex. What we are told is that somehow large prokaryotes ate small prokaryotes, and this is what resulted. Somehow the smaller ones turned into nucleoids with thousands now, strands of DNA. Not hundreds, thousands. And they are, as you see, nucleus. Now, everything past this is eukaryotic in nature. We are eukaryotic creatures. We have nuclei in our cells. So that the prokaryotes without nuclei, everything else comes down apparently from the eukaryotes because they have them. Understand that. Now, these dominate, again, single-celled bacteria dominate for another 1.4 billion years, down to 600 million years ago, when the next life form appears. Now that, next slide please, that one is diacaran fauna. Now these are multi-celled creatures. These are not single-celled anymore, they're multi-celled. They come at around 600 million years ago, and they dominate for 70 million years. We do not know what they were. There were hundreds of them, mostly circles and ovals. This is an oblong, but they had no fronts, no backs, no tops, no bottoms, no insides, no outsides. We do not know what they were. We don't know if they were plants or animals. So that's why we have to depict them. If it was an animal, it was a bottom crawling kind of thing. If it was a plant, it was like a seaweed type thing. Diacaran fauna. They dominate to 530 million years ago, when something happens that is so bizarre, so weird, so incredible, not even Darwinists pretend that it's a Darwinian event. Next slide, please. At 530 million years ago, the Cambrian Explosion occurs. And within a matter of 10 million years, from 530 to 520, now that sounds like a long time to us, but relative to what has come before, this is overnight. We have thousands of new, very complicated animals creatures appearing on the earth, in the seas only, not on the land, in the seas, and it's the Cambrian Explosion. As you see, we have males and females, predators and prey, armor, jaws, claws, the works. All 26 animal phyla